What does a movie have to do before a government decides adults should not be allowed to see it? Some infamous films were banned for a few years and later returned. As of 2026, each still carries an official refusal or ban somewhere in the world. And the reasons range from politics and religion to disturbing content, controversial casting, and scenes censors believed crossed a line that even an adults-only rating could not fix. Before we begin, like this video, share it with another movie fan, and subscribe to the channel. Number 20. Barbie, 2023. Few people walked into Barbie expecting to watch a movie that would end up banned anywhere. On the surface, Greta Gerwig's comedy is bright, funny, colorful, and built around one of the most famous toys ever created. But underneath the pink houses and exaggerated jokes sits a story about identity, social expectations, power, and the uncomfortable gap between fantasy and real life. The plot begins when Barbie suddenly stops behaving like the perfectly happy version of herself. She starts thinking about death, her feet change, and her flawless routine breaks apart. Looking for answers, she travels with Ken from Barbieland to Los Angeles. There she discovers a world where women do not automatically control everything, while Ken becomes fascinated by a very simplified idea of male authority. One of the movie's most famous sequences comes after Ken returns to Barbieland and transforms it into his own ridiculous kingdom. The scene is played for comedy, but it also turns the film's argument about gender roles into something impossible to miss. That was enough to create serious trouble in Kuwait. In August 2023, the country officially banned Barbie, with state media saying the decision was intended to protect public ethics and social traditions. Lebanon initially moved toward a ban too, although it later approved the film for release. Kuwait's ban, however, made one of the biggest mainstream hits of the decade, part of a censorship story almost nobody predicted. Number 19. Talk to Me, 2023. The strangest thing about the controversy surrounding this Australian horror hit is that the censorship battle was not mainly about its supernatural scenes. That is surprising, because Talk to Me contains plenty of material that could make nervous regulators uncomfortable. The story follows Mia, a teenager still dealing with the loss of her mother. She and a group of friends discover a preserved hand that supposedly allows people to contact spirits. The rules seem simple: hold the hand, say the right words, and allow a spirit to briefly enter. At first, the group treats the experience like a party challenge, filming one another and laughing at the strange behavior that follows. The movie's signature sequence happens during one of those gatherings. A character grips the hand, the atmosphere changes immediately, and what was being treated as entertainment suddenly feels dangerously real. That decision drives everything that follows. Kuwait banned Talk to Me in 2023. Reuters reported the official explanation as protecting public ethics and social traditions, while industry reporting connected the decision to actor Zoe Terakes, who is non-binary and transmasculine. Remarkably, that aspect of Terakese's identity is not even a plot point in the film, so a supernatural horror movie about reckless teenagers became controversial for something happening completely outside its ghost story. If you enjoy movie history that goes beyond the usual Hollywood stories, subscribe now and turn on notifications. And share this video with someone who thinks movie bans disappeared decades ago. Number 18. Snow White, 2025. A Disney fairy tale might sound like one of the safest possible choices for an international release. Yet the 2025 live-action Snow White became caught in a political dispute that had almost nothing to do with magical mirrors, poisoned apples, or fantasy violence. This remake again follows a young princess living under the control of the evil queen. Rachel Zegler plays Snow White, while Gal Gadot appears as the queen, a ruler obsessed with status and beauty. As the story develops, Snow White leaves the palace, finds allies beyond the queen's control, and gradually moves from frightened survivor to someone willing to challenge the kingdom's leadership. The familiar magic mirror scenes naturally became some of the movie's most recognizable moments. Each time the queen asks who is fairest, the fairy tale conflict becomes less about beauty itself and more about insecurity, jealousy, and power. But none of that caused the ban in Lebanon. In April 2025, Lebanese authorities blocked the film because Gadot is Israeli and had long been associated with the country's boycott policies involving Israeli performers. The order came from Lebanon's interior minister during an already tense political period. The issue was the nationality and public identity of one of its stars. It is a perfect example of how censorship does not always begin with content. Sometimes a movie can be rejected before the lights even go down, simply because the people appearing in it have become part of a much larger political conflict. Number 17. Death on the Nile, 2022. A luxury riverboat, beautiful Egyptian scenery, expensive costumes, secret romances, and one of literature's most famous detectives should have made Death on the Nile easy international entertainment. Instead, its casting turned the movie into another political censorship case. Kenneth Branagh returns as Hercule Poirot, who finds himself traveling aboard a glamorous Nile steamer filled with wealthy passengers whose relationships are far less peaceful than they first appear. Jealousy follows the group from elegant hotels to ancient ruins, and eventually a passenger is found dead. The movie's most famous section is the investigation that follows. Poirot begins questioning nearly everyone on board, slowly revealing financial motives, romantic betrayals, grudges, and carefully hidden connections. The pleasure of the story comes from discovering that almost every passenger has a reason to lie. Yet Lebanon and Kuwait banned the film from cinemas in 2022 because Gal Gadot, who plays Lynette, is Israeli. Gadot had also previously served in Israel's military, something that had already contributed to censorship of other films featuring her. So the mystery audiences were supposed to debate was, who committed the crime? In two countries, the bigger question became whether the movie would be allowed onto screens at all. The result is one of the clearest cases on this list, where a mainstream studio production became restricted not because of its story, but because international politics followed one performer straight into the cinema. Number 16. Lightyear, 2022. Buzz Lightyear had spent decades being one of Pixar's most recognizable characters. But when Disney tried to turn the fictional space hero into the star of his own science fiction adventure, a moment lasting only seconds became more controversial than all of the aliens, robots, and laser battles around it. Lightyear is presented as the movie that supposedly inspired the Buzz toy seen in Toy Story. Determined to fix his mistake, he repeatedly tests experimental fuel that might allow everyone to escape. The emotional centerpiece arrives through time dilation. Each flight feels short to Buzz, but years pass for the people waiting on the planet. He watches his friend Alicia Hawthorne build a relationship, start a family, grow older, and eventually disappear from his life while he remains almost unchanged. The montage gives an otherwise playful adventure a surprisingly sad core. A brief kiss between Alicia and her wife became the censorship flashpoint. The United Arab Emirates officially banned the film, saying it violated the country's media content standards, and the movie did not receive releases in a number of other markets. The controversy was especially striking because the disputed moment is tiny compared with the film's running time. Remove the headlines and Lightyear is mostly a story about guilt, friendship, lost time, and Buzz learning that perfection is not worth sacrificing the life happening around him. Yet that brief family moment determined whether entire audiences were allowed to see the movie theatrically. Number 15. Eternals, 2021. Marvel had already shown audiences gods, aliens, talking animals, collapsing planets, and half the universe disappearing. But Eternals discovered that one quiet domestic scene could create more international trouble than any giant monster. The film introduces a group of immortal beings who have secretly lived on Earth for thousands of years. They were sent to protect humanity from creatures known as deviants, then scattered across the world after believing their mission was finished. When the deviants return, the Eternals reunite and discover that the purpose behind their existence is far darker and more complicated than they were told. Among the ensemble is Phastos, an inventor who has lost faith in humanity after witnessing how technological progress can be used destructively. By the present day, however, he has built a peaceful life with his husband and their young son. A brief kiss between Phastos and his husband became the scene most associated with the movie's censorship battle. Before release, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Qatar did not permit the planned theatrical version after Disney reportedly declined requested edits. That decision was notable because the relationship is not a side joke or hidden background detail. So while Eternals spends enormous amounts of money showing cosmic beings debating the fate of Earth, the scene that caused the greatest real-world battle is one of its smallest, a superhero saying goodbye to his family before leaving to save everyone else. Number 14. The Kashmir Files, 2022. Few entries here became part of a national political argument as quickly as the Kashmir Files. Rather than being treated simply as a drama, the movie became a debate about history, memory, representation, and whether cinema can deepen tensions while claiming to reveal a truth that others ignored. The story follows Krishna, a young university student who has grown up with an incomplete understanding of his family's past. Through conversations, memories, and testimony, he learns about the flight of Kashmiri Pandits from the Kashmir Valley around 1990 and begins questioning what he has been taught. Much of the movie's force comes from scenes in which older characters describe what happened to families and communities during that period. Instead of presenting history as distant information, the film makes Krishna absorb it personally, forcing him to reconsider his identity and the beliefs encouraged by people around him. The film became a major success in India and received strong praise from supporters who believed it highlighted ignored suffering. Critics, however, accused it of presenting a one-sided picture that could intensify hostility. Singapore's authorities banned the film in 2022. Officials said its portrayal of Muslims was provocative and one-sided, and warned that the movie could create hostility between religious communities and disrupt social harmony. Its controversial power comes not from frightening fictional images, but from competing claims about real history. For regulators, releasing it risked turning historical pain into present-day division. Number 13. To Kill a War Machine, 2025. This documentary has one of the strangest censorship histories of any recent British film, because it was not simply rejected from the beginning. It received a certificate, became legally ready for cinema release, and then had that approval taken away after the political and legal situation changed around it. To Kill a War Machine follows the activist group Palestine Action and documents members involved in direct action protests against facilities connected to the Israeli defense industry. Directors Hanan Majid and Richard York focus on the people behind the organization, their motives, their planning, their confrontations with authorities, and the consequences of their activism. Unlike fictional movies elsewhere on this list, there is no monster, serial criminal, or fantasy villain. The tension comes from watching real participants knowingly place themselves in situations that could end in arrest or prosecution because they believe their actions are morally justified. The Beefy-Bled FC originally classified the documentary 15 and uncut for cinema release on June 5, 2025. Then the British government moved to proscribe Palestine Action under the Terrorism Act 2000. On July 4th, the B-Filt FC revoked the film's classification. Its official explanation said that after the organization's proscription took effect, further distribution or exhibition was likely to constitute an offense under the Act, and B-Filt FC policy does not classify material whose distribution would breach criminal law. Weeks later, the same film had become officially unsuitable for classification. Number 12. Ken Park, 2002. A movie centered on troubled teenagers became one of Australia's most notorious censorship cases when regulators decided an adults-only rating was still not enough. Directed by Larry Clark and Edward Lockman, Ken Park follows several young people in suburban California whose seemingly ordinary homes hide dysfunctional families, isolation, anger, and difficult relationships. Rather than building toward one traditional plot, the film moves between different characters, showing how their private lives clash with the normal image their neighborhood presents. Its most controversial sequences involve intimate situations featuring teenage characters, and the film deliberately presents those moments in an unusually direct, confrontational style. Australian authorities refused Ken Park classification in 2003 after the Classification Review Board reconsidered its status. Australia's government classification records continue to list the film as refused classification, preventing normal commercial distribution there. That lasting RC status makes it a much stronger fit for this countdown than famous banned movies, whose restrictions were eventually lifted. Number 11. The Gestapo's Last Orgy, 1977. Even among the notorious European exploitation movies of the 1970s, The Gestapo's Last Orgy occupies an uncomfortable place. It mixes imagery associated with the Holocaust and concentration camps with sensationalized exploitation, creating a combination that has remained controversial for decades. The story begins when a Jewish woman returns to the location of a former concentration camp where she had once been imprisoned. Much of what the audience sees is therefore presented through flashbacks, gradually revealing the relationship between survivor and persecutor. One of the film's defining features is the way historical horror is used not merely as background, but as the central spectacle. Instead of treating suffering mainly as tragedy, the film repeatedly frames humiliation and cruelty in the heightened style of exploitation cinema. When a distributor sought a British home entertainment classification in 2021, the BFOLMC refused the film outright. Its published reasoning cited a sustained focus on abusive and sadistic material and concluded that the central concept itself crossed the board's threshold. Modern British classifiers watched the film again more than 40 years after it was made and decided it still could not receive an adults-only certificate. The result raises a difficult question that follows many movies on this list. When does showing historical cruelty become commentary, And when does the way it is presented turn suffering into exploitation? For the BFLET, this film landed on the wrong side of that line. Number 10. Love Camp 7, 1969. Long before the European exploitation boom reached its peak, Love Camp 7 helped establish a formula that would later become infamous, combine wartime prison imagery with sensationalized abuse, and package the result as adults-only entertainment. The story follows two female Allied agents who voluntarily enter a German prison camp during the Second World War. Their goal is to locate another prisoner who possesses valuable information. To complete the mission, however, the agents must pretend to be ordinary captives and survive the same treatment being imposed on everyone around them. The premise gives the movie the shape of an undercover thriller, but its reputation comes from how frequently it stops advancing the mission and concentrates instead on degradation inside the camp. Those sequences helped inspire a wave of similar productions during the following decade. Britain's censorship history with the movie is unusually persistent. The BFLET first refused Love Camp 7 a classification for DVD release in 2002. Then the film came back. In 2020, another submission was made for video-on-demand distribution. The BFLET examined it again and again refused classification. The board said the film's focus on abusive behavior was so pervasive that cuts were not a realistic solution. The film was not simply banned once and forgotten. A modern distributor gave it another chance in a completely different media era, when adults can stream far stronger material than television once allowed. More than 50 years after production, its censorship problem remains attached to the movie itself. Number 9. Hate Crime, 2013. Hate crime uses that style for a different purpose: to trap the audience inside a home invasion motivated by extremist hatred. The story concerns a Jewish family celebrating a birthday when attackers enter their house and take control. Because the movie is presented through handheld and home video style footage, there is almost no visual distance between the viewer and the family's ordeal. The camera moves through rooms, catches panic in real time, and makes the situation feel less like a polished thriller than material someone was never supposed to see. Instead of cutting away quickly or shifting toward a police investigation, the movie stays with the attackers and their victims for long stretches. When Hate Crime was submitted to the BFLET in 2015, the board refused classification. Its published decision said the film focused in an unremitting way on physical and sexual abuse aggravated by racist invective, while providing little context beyond a closing statement about what happened afterward. Regulators also considered whether cuts could produce an acceptable version. They concluded that the problematic content ran throughout the movie, making ordinary editing impractical. That is why Hate Crime remains more than a film that simply received an 18 rating. In Britain, its official BFLET record still marks it as unsuitable for classification. The filmmakers may have intended to condemn hatred by confronting viewers with it. The censors decided the presentation itself created too great a risk of harm. Number 8. The Bunny Game, 2011. Black and white photography often makes a film feel elegant, nostalgic, or artistic. The harsh monochrome images make the entire story feel stripped of comfort, as though the audience has been dropped into a nightmare with nowhere else to look. The film follows Bunny, a woman living an unstable life and moving through a bleak world of temporary encounters. After accepting a ride from a truck driver, she is abducted and taken into an isolated environment. From that point forward, the movie largely abandons ordinary plot development and becomes a prolonged confrontation between captor and captive. There is no clever detective racing to locate her, and no comforting subplot providing relief. The film concentrates on psychological domination, threats, humiliation, and Bunny's attempts to endure what is happening. Its most talked about sequences are remembered less for any single image than for their relentless tone. The BFLET refused the movie classification in 2011. Its published decision said the abuse of the kidnapped woman occupies the greater part of the film and that the presentation risks encouraging viewers to share in the captor's callous attitude. The board also examined whether cuts might work, but because the objectionable treatment was so pervasive, it refused the work. That decision remains visible on the BFLET's current database, where The Bunny Game is still marked unsuitable for classification for physical media and streaming. For British regulators, the lack of distance from the abuse is exactly why it remains unacceptable. Number 7. Grotesque, 2009. Japan has produced some of the world's boldest horror cinema, but even within that tradition, Grotesque earned a reputation for testing how much punishment a movie can place on screen before story almost disappears. A young man and woman are abducted by a stranger after an ordinary meeting. They awaken restrained and discover that their captor has turned them into participants in a private experiment. He claims he wants to test their emotions, their devotion to each other, and how far they will go to keep one another alive. One of its most effective tricks is giving the couple brief moments of hope. When Grotesque reached the BPLED-FC in 2009, regulators refused it a certificate. The board's official description says that the majority of the running time focuses on the humiliation, assault, and extreme mistreatment of the kidnapped pair. The key issue was not simply that the movie was violent. Plenty of violent horror films receive an 18 certificate in Britain. The problem was the sustained concentration on suffering and what the BPLED-FC saw as insufficient narrative or contextual justification. It was not ordered to remove one notorious shot or shorten one famous sequence. The regulator believed the entire construction of the movie created the problem. Its current BCBLFC listing still says unsuitable for classification, leaving the original British censorship decision firmly in place. For the BCBLFC, it remains an example of where adult choice can still meet an official limit. Number 6. Murder Set Pieces, 2004. Las Vegas usually appears on screen as a city of bright signs, casinos, crowds, and endless nighttime energy. The central character is a photographer who appears outwardly functional, but secretly lives as a serial attacker. Instead of building the story mainly around detectives trying to identify him, the movie spends much of its time following the offender himself. Viewers see his routines, his searches for victims, and the disturbing double life hidden behind his professional appearance. The BPLFC believed the film repeatedly connected sexualized imagery with non-consensual pain and humiliation, while also involving younger victims in threatening contexts. The board's concern was not just about individual violent scenes, but about the pattern created across the entire movie. When Murder Set Pieces was submitted for British home video classification, the BPLED-FC rejected it in 2008. Officials considered whether a heavily edited version could receive a certificate. Their conclusion was unusually severe. Objectionable content appeared so consistently that removing it would leave little more than preparation and setup for scenes that could no longer remain. In other words, cuts would not simply shorten the movie, they would dismantle its basic structure. The BPLED's current record continues to list Murder Set Pieces as unsuitable for classification for physical media and streaming. It never became a mainstream horror hit, yet its official refusal placed it in a tiny group of 21st century movies that British regulators would not pass even for adults. Here, controversy became almost the entire reason the wider world learned its name. Number 5. Maniac, 2012. The most important creative decision in Maniac is also the reason its censorship story became so unusual. For most of the movie, the audience does not simply watch the dangerous main character. Elijah Wood plays Frank, a lonely mannequin restorer living in Los Angeles. He appears quiet and awkward during ordinary conversation, but he secretly stalks women while struggling with severe psychological problems connected to his past. When he meets photographer Anna, a genuine friendship seems possible, creating the question of whether Frank can control the part of himself he has been hiding. Director Frank Halfoun shoots most of the story from Frank's first-person perspective. When he follows someone down a street, the camera follows because the camera is effectively Frank. That technique made the film more than another remake of William Lustig's 1980 cult horror picture. It also became the core of the censorship concern in New Zealand. Authorities there classified the film as objectionable for general distribution in 2013. Limited festival screenings could occur under specific conditions, but ordinary theatrical and home video release was blocked. Regulators were particularly concerned that the first-person presentation placed viewers too closely inside the offender's perspective. It is a fascinating censorship argument because changing the camera style would change the entire movie. Keep it, and the audience experiences precisely the uncomfortable identification that worried the censor. In this case, the film's most praised stylistic idea and its biggest censorship problem were exactly the same thing. Number 4. Megan is Missing, 2011. For years, Megan is Missing existed as a small found-footage movie that many horror fans had never even heard of. Then social media discovered it. Reaction videos spread, and suddenly a film shot years earlier was frightening a new generation that encountered its most notorious moments without warning. The story follows two teenage friends, Megan and Amy. When Megan begins messaging someone who claims to be a teenage boy, the conversations seem ordinary enough. Amy starts looking for answers, reviewing messages and trying to understand who Megan had really been talking to. The movie presents the investigation through webcams, photographs, news material, and handheld footage. intentionally creating the feeling that viewers are watching recovered evidence rather than a polished fictional production. Its most infamous sequence comes late in the film, when Amy discovers evidence connected to Megan's disappearance. Another extended final scene pushes the story into territory many viewers found overwhelming. Director Michael Goy later publicly warned people discovering the movie through TikTok that the final section was intense. The decision focused especially on sexualized violence involving young characters and the way the material was presented. A government restriction can limit normal distribution, but the internet can turn forbidden material into a challenge people actively search for. Instead of fading away, Megan is Missing became more notorious years after release, largely because audiences kept asking the same question: what could possibly happen in the final 20 minutes to create this reputation? Number 3. I Spit on Your Grave, 2010. Few horror stories have generated censorship arguments across generations, quite like I Spit on Your Grave. The 2010 remake took a premise already notorious from the 1978 original and rebuilt it with modern production values, creating a new wave of outrage and debate. Jennifer Hills is a writer who rents an isolated cabin so she can work away from the city. But after an encounter with several local men turns threatening, she becomes the target of a prolonged attack. Her attackers assume the story is over. The second half transforms the film into a revenge thriller. Jennifer returns, watches the men from a distance, and creates individual traps designed around their earlier behavior. The most famous scenes come from this reversal, when characters who once believed they controlled everything slowly realize that Jennifer has been preparing for them. Supporters of the film argue that this structure places power back in the victim's hands. Critics and censors have questioned whether spending so much time on the first half can be justified by the revenge that follows. New Zealand's classification authorities banned the 2010 film as objectionable. Their concerns included the relationship between sexual violence and the way force and submission are presented. The 1978 original had faced bans and severe cuts in multiple territories, meaning the remake did not inherit only a plot. Is the movie condemning cruelty by making the audience desperate to see Jennifer fight back, or does the path to that revenge spend too long showing exactly what it claims to criticize? New Zealand's regulator answered with a ban. Number 2. The Human Centipede 2, Full Sequence, 2011. Most filmmakers respond to controversy by becoming more careful. Tom Six responded to the outrage surrounding The Human Centipede by making a sequel that essentially says, "You thought the first film went too far? Watch what happens when someone inside the story becomes obsessed with it." That is the clever, ugly joke behind Full Sequence. The first Human Centipede exists as a movie within this movie. The story therefore turns public fear about dangerous media into its actual premise. What if someone watches an extreme horror film and decides to imitate it? Most of the notorious second half takes place in an abandoned warehouse, where Martin attempts his crude version of the experiment. The black and white photography gives the film an artificial, nightmarish texture, but censors did not believe style made the content harmless. The B-Filet FC originally refused classification completely in 2011. After the distributor agreed to extensive changes, a heavily cut British version eventually received an 18 certificate. Australia also refused classification to the original submitted version before a modified edition was later approved at R18+. New Zealand went further with the DVD version, classifying it as objectionable in 2012. Edited versions have circulated legally in some places, so saying The Human Centipede 2 is banned everywhere would be false. The real story is more interesting. The complete version became unacceptable to multiple regulators, and in New Zealand, the relevant version remained prohibited. The sequel was designed to turn outrage into content, and the censorship response almost became part of the marketing. Number 1. A Serbian Film, 2010. If modern censorship has a title that functions almost like a warning label, A Serbian Film is probably it. Plenty of people know its reputation without ever seeing a single frame, and that reputation has lasted because regulators in multiple countries treated the film not simply as extreme, but as something that could not be released normally in its original form. The story follows Miloš, a retired adult film performer who is trying to live quietly with his wife and young son. His financial problems lead him to accept a lucrative final project from a mysterious director who refuses to explain the production, leaving Miloš unsure what he has agreed to until filming begins. Then the director's methods become increasingly manipulative, and Miloš realizes he has entered something far more dangerous than an ordinary film set. His attempts to understand what has happened and protect his family drive the story toward the notorious final act. Several late scenes made the movie internationally infamous, but describing them in detail is unnecessary. Their purpose is clearly to shock, and even audiences familiar with extreme cinema often cite the ending as a point where the film becomes almost impossible to discuss without controversy. Director Srđan Spasojević has described the work as political allegory, connecting its extremity to exploitation, powerlessness, and Serbia's recent history. Australia's Classification Review Board refused a Serbian film classification in September 2011. The Australian government's current database still records the original version as RC, or refused classification. New Zealand also classified the film as objectionable in 2012, while other countries demanded major cuts or blocked releases. Many legendary banned movies eventually become normal catalog titles once standards change. A Serbian film entered the censorship system in the modern era and still carries official prohibitions years later. The censorship battle is part of what the movie has become. So where should the line be drawn? Should adults always decide for themselves? Or are there movies governments are justified in keeping out of normal circulation? These 20 titles prove censorship did not disappear with old Hollywood. It still happens because of politics, religion, identity, and content regulators believe crosses legal limits. Tell us which band surprised you most. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this countdown with another serious movie fan.